Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from or whether you're catching us in a replay. It is your girl, Marcie Thomas, and I am so excited to be here with you again for another episode of Live Well Sister. And this is one that you all are really going to enjoy, I hope, as we talk about something that is important to all of us, and that is food, because we all got to eat. And if you've been watching throughout the month, actually, this is the second time this month we've talked about healthy eating. And so I'm glad that we started and ended this wonderful month of July on a good and delicious note. So for those of you who haven't watched before, I am Marcie Thomas, as it says, founder of Brown Girl Collective and Live Well Sister. And it's just a wonderful space for us to come together and talk about things to help us to live our best lives. I am coming to you from the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, by way of Cleveland, Ohio, and a bunch of other places because I was once in the military. So if you don't mind dropping a note to let us know where you're joining us from, just so we can see who all is here, that would be wonderful. So I'm really excited tonight because we are going to be talking to Catherine Perez, who is known to the world as the plant-based RD with over 1 million followers out there, everybody. So she is really doing things to help people understand the importance of a plant-based lifestyle, whether you're a vegan or just eating more veggies. And we'll get into that once she comes on board. But it's really a good conversation, and I'm excited to have her here to talk about her upcoming, it's not out yet, I got an advance here, her upcoming beautiful cookbook that is Peaceful Kitchen. So we're going to talk about that. Now, Catherine earned her master's degree in human nutrition at Drexel University and has worked as an outpatient cardiology dietitian, a grocery store dietitian, corporate dietitian, and virtual nutrition counselor. Her education informed creative, nutritious recipes she started sharing on that plant-based RD on Instagram and the blog as well as a newsletter. Her work has been featured in Shape, Mind, Body, Green, and the Wall Street Journal. So without any further delay, let's welcome Catherine to Live Well Sister. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Marcie. Really excited to be here.
Yes, and I'm excited to have you here. Y'all see this big old smile I got on my face, and I'm still holding the cookbook in my hand, right? Because I just really love it. And we're going to get into showing folks some pictures and stuff like that, so they can see what excited me so much. So, first of all, congratulations on putting this book out into the world.
Thank you. It was a lot of work. For those that know about writing a whole book in general, it's a multiple year process.
Yes.
So it's I feel like it's now feeling more real, especially now that it's a couple of weeks out, but I'm really excited for it to finally be out and hoping everyone enjoys it.
Yes. So let's get a little bit into your actual story and how you came into this world of being a registered dietitian. That's what the RD stands for. Yeah. And, what led you to be plant-based. So just a little bit of your background, which is included in the book as well, but for those who don't know.
Yes. So I often start my story by saying I feel like a lot of the things I ended up getting into feel like it all happened on accident. There was a lot of different avenues I thought I was going to take my career. I thought I was going to be a doctor. I thought, I would be a graphic designer. Never thought about dietitian at all. And really that thought started when a family member became ill, and they needed to find out how they were supposed to eat. And if anyone's familiar with diabetes, for example, usually you get a diagnosis and they might give you some medication, but oftentimes they give you either very vague nutrition advice, or, they tell you what not to eat instead of like what you should be eating. And so when this family member came to me, they were like, can you help me figure this out? And I didn't know, because I wasn't a dietitian at the time.
Right.
But I did, was working towards like my biology degree at the time. And I was very familiar with research. So I was like, all right, I'll look up all the information for you and we'll figure it out together. So I ended up searching, we came up with lists, and in that same thought process, I was just very interested in the information I was reading about. So I kind of dived in more, was looking more into nutrition, especially because I started becoming more concerned about my own health at the time. And, when you see someone going through something, you're like, I don't want to go through that. And even from like what I was looking at from like my own physical condition at the time, I was like, I feel like I could be better.
Right.
So I ended up looking to see like what would be the most ideal way to eat. And, now that I look at it now, versus back then, there's a lot of answers to that. But at the time, I kind of gravitated towards a lot of information regarding like eating more plants and the benefit of eating more fruits and vegetables, and, read about the Mediterranean diet, found information on plant-based eating. It was very, I gravitated towards that for some reason. And when I gravitated towards that, I kind of made the decision. I was like, okay, I feel like this is the right path. So I decided to kind of give it a shot and see what would happen. So I started, I like to say cold tofu instead of cold turkey.
Cold tofu. That's
But, I made the switch overnight. I don't recommend that for a lot of people. But for me, I was just kind of like once I make a decision, I just go all in. And I felt like I knew enough information from what I was researching to do it correctly. So I started, and then I felt really, really good. And, I was losing weight. My cholesterol was at like the best levels ever at that time when I, started. And, heart health is definitely a risk factor in my family. So, it was helping me to avoid a lot of chronic conditions I was, concerned about. And so I decided to stick with it longer than I had originally anticipated. So I kept doing, the plant-based eating lifestyle. And then eventually I was like, I feel like I should be educating or teaching people. And I was getting that feedback from other people, because people would be asking me questions, especially based on the food I was bringing in, to work.
Right.
I would get people asking questions and I would just like chime in with an answer. And I really enjoyed doing that. So I just felt gravitated towards that career path. So I started my master's in human nutrition, and then did my internship, and knew during that time I wanted to be involved with wellness, because I feel like preventative medicine is kind of like the most important thing that we should be focusing on. I feel like too many people wait until like something's wrong and try to fix it, versus like, hey, you could be doing X, Y, and Z, and this could be benefiting you. So I really wanted to kind of educate on that. And so when I finally got my RD, I started doing some outpatient counseling. I worked at a grocery store. I was doing a lot of stuff where I could try and reach as many people as possible. Because as a counselor, as rewarding as it is to be able to help someone one-on-one, you're very limited in terms of how many people you can see in a day.
That's true.
Yeah, because you can only see like 8 people, and you can technically like reach out to more people here and there, just based on indirect contact. Like you speak to someone, you speak to a patient, and then they speak to somebody else, and then that message spreads. So then eventually I started sharing recipes online. It's kind of out of a desire to share more, but also clients were asking me for recipes. So I was like, all right, I'll just share some stuff online. And that's kind of how plant-based RD started. It was kind of like, I wasn't meaning to do that. Like that wasn't necessarily a passion. I wasn't going into the dietitian realm because like I had wanted to. I wanted to be a doctor at the time. But a lot of those things kind of had me fall into a new adventure that I wasn't really anticipating. And originally, when I started Instagram, I didn't really think much of it in terms of like, oh yeah, I'm going to shoot for like 1 million followers or anything.
Wow, yes, because that's pretty impressive, especially for somebody who wasn't aiming for that.
Yeah, like it was not on my radar. And I feel like a lot of the things that, I even did throughout this whole career path on social media, I feel like it's not the traditional sense of how things usually work for people to get to that number. So I'm always very grateful, but I kind of achieved the goal I wanted to in terms of being able to reach more people, in terms of spreading that message, because I feel like the internet in general is very clouded with a lot of misinformation, a lot of fear mongering. There's a lot going on.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing you didn't really mention that I found was interesting in your story is that when you have a Dominican and Mexican background,
Yes.
and that when you made a decision that your mom was like, say what?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's kind of like a little side story to the main story. And that is one, like you said, I'm Dominican and Mexican, and my mom is very opinionated, and she didn't really understand what vegan was, or, what that meant in terms of food. In fact, like in the beginning, she was kind of offended. She thought I was like bad mouthing her food because I didn't want to eat it. It's very disrespectful not to eat like food that's presented to you. And it took her a long time before she could like get on board with it. But it was more so just kind of reassuring her like, hey, I can still have some traditional meals. They just need to be modified slightly. So like, for example, I have moro in my book, which is like a rice-based dish, and there's different ways of making it. But my mom would often use something called sopita, which is like the equivalent of like chicken bouillon, inside of the rice. And I just told her, like, can you just use a vegetable base, instead of the chicken base? And she was like, oh, okay, I could do that. And then she would still make me things like plátanos fritos and, yes, that. So she would continue making that. And then eventually I learned from her how to make a lot of Dominican dishes. So I was able to kind of infuse that in some of the stuff that I was sharing. So I'm glad that eventually we were able to kind of clear the air there. But one of the reasons that was a big deal for me was because I didn't know how to cook before. Like when I was growing up, I always joked with my mom, like, I would get married someday, but this person would be doing all the cooking. And eventually I did have to learn, because like my mom wasn't going to do the cooking initially. Like she just didn't know what to do, or like what vegan meant. So I had to kind of figure that out myself. And in doing that, I was able to kind of like, I don't know, I feel like I benefited a lot more from learning all the things that I did years ago when I first started, because now I feel like a lot of like the cooking techniques and things like that make a lot more sense. And, it helps you to kind of like get to a state where you can kind of like taste and adjust as you go along with a recipe.
Right. I love that. I love that. Well, we're going to back up just a little bit, because we have mentioned two things. We have mentioned being plant-based and being a vegan. So for those who may not know what the difference is, explain that.
Yeah. So there is a difference between plant-based and vegan. vegan will always be like an ethical choice. And it goes kind of beyond food. So you might choose not to, use any products that have any animal, derivative. So like, for example, you wouldn't use leather, if you're vegan because it's coming from an animal. So there's a lot of like that philosophical side to it and kind of, choosing paths that help to reduce harm. Whereas plant-based, living in general is more focused on the food side of things. So vegans technically are plant-based because they are consuming all plants, but you don't have to be vegan to be plant-based because it's only talking about the diet portion of things.
Right.
And even from that perspective, there's kind of like degrees of plant-based. Like some people might be 100% plant-based where they're not consuming any animal products. And then you'll have plant-based people that, maybe lean more towards vegetarian, like predominantly most of their, consumption is plant-based. Mediterranean diet is considered plant-based diet. So, those are things to kind of consider when you are changing any dietary patterns, is to kind of decide what works best for you. But all of those different streams, whenever you're adding more plants to your plate, you are going to get benefit from it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And one of the things, we talked about this a little bit before we came on, but I think that there are a lot of people out there that think, oh, I can't be plant-based because they have all of these ideas about what it means to just eat plants. I always joke around and say grass and sticks. We're not just eating grass and sticks.
Yes.
It's just a mindset shift. And for a lot of us, it's not that we never eat vegetables, but it's the way that we eat the vegetables. Either it's something that's like really plain and bland, or it's something that, I'm thinking like collard greens or mustard greens, or even if we're eating beans and we're putting a piece of meat or a piece of salt pork or something in it. So it's not that we're not eating those things. Sometimes it's in the preparation.
Yes, that's very true. I think there's kind of, like you mentioned, this unfortunate like shadow that's over plant-based eating where people assume that it's going to be tasteless, or that there's no way that anyone can fathom eating plant-based. But if we look at our just regular cuisine, like the standard American diet, there are quite a number of components of a day-to-day meal that are technically like plant-based that we don't really give second thought to, if you're thinking about chips and beer, they're technically vegan because they don't have like those animal derivatives to them. And then there's like the degrees of like how you want to kind of prepare those foods, right? So like if you're thinking about making a wholesome meal that's going to be flavorful, you have to kind of know like what ingredients you want to throw in. So, if you're focusing on eating a lot of processed foods, it's probably not going to make you feel your best. And there also might be things that you might not like flavor-wise that you're able to kind of like adjust, versus if you're cooking for yourself, you can kind of adjust those flavors how you would like them to be. So there's a lot of essential like playing room that you can have with that food to make it very enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because I think that a lot of us have boring diets just in general. And by boring, I mean that we have a tendency to eat the same stuff over and over, or we're preparing it the same way over and over. And so when you think of, oh, well, I'm going to shift into something else, we think that that's got to be boring too, because technically what we're already eating is kind of boring. So
I feel like that was kind of the one benefit that I noticed right away when I switched over to plant-based eating, is that, but prior to that, I felt like I was very stuck in a safe like little zone of foods that I was comfortable with. And obviously when you're making a major dietary change, there's going to be that period of time where you're like, I don't know what to eat. But then you kind of start learning, okay, well, technically I can eat this and I can eat this. And it starts opening up like this whole world of cuisine that you weren't even aware of. I think like one of my favorite dietary experiences was one time was discovering Ethiopian food. And I remember the first time I had that, thinking like, oh, we're probably not going to be able to get much because we're thinking, oh, there's probably going to be more animal-based dishes versus vegetarian dishes. But they had quite a number of different options for us to try, and each of them have their own unique flavors. And then that got me like looking at the spices that they used, and then it really opened my eyes to like other cultures outside of that and seeing like, all right, so this culture has this, what flavors are they playing with, and how can I start infusing those into the foods that I'm eating? Because like a lot of those new flavors I was learning about, they made the food way more exciting versus just the bland things that you might start off eating when you're kind of just discovering a new way of eating in general.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. Another thing, because I told you, at one point in time, I was a vegetarian, but I wasn't a healthy vegetarian because, yes, I was not eating meat, but I was eating a whole bunch of French fries and, a bunch of other stuff. So it's like, yes, you can eliminate the meat from the diet, but if you don't figure out ways to incorporate good and healthy other things to your diet, then you still can not be healthy.
Yes, that's very true. I think that's sometimes what ends up throwing people off when they do make the switch over to a plant-based diet, is that a lot of people just assume, okay, I just have to take the animal products out. And it's kind of going back to what I was talking about when someone gets like a diabetes diagnosis. Right. Everyone's very quick to tell you what not to eat. And there's not a focus of, okay, well, if I'm supposed to take this off my plate, what am I supposed to replace it with? Because if you just take the meat off of your plate, you're taking off a significant amount of protein from that plate. And if you're just left with like the starch and vegetables, well, yes, the vegetables are technically healthy. You can't get all of the nutrients that you need in a single meal by just eating a bowl of spinach, unless you're eating like pounds and pounds of spinach, which I don't think anyone would really truly enjoy too much.
No. And so I love spinach, but no.
Right. So it's one of those things where balance is really important, and making sure that, when something is being taken off of the scale, you're adding something back onto that scale to like even that balance out. Because then you're going to be able to properly nourish yourself. It's going to be easier versus kind of like the scenario I mentioned with the spinach. Like you'd have to eat like a ridiculous amount. And even then, like that's not really realistic or safe to be doing. Right. So you want to try and choose, the portions, the types of foods that are going to best nourish yourself, and everyone's nutrition is going to be slightly different because everyone's different.
Right. Now, in the book, you also talk a little bit about your food philosophy. What is your food philosophy?
So a big portion of my philosophy surrounds the word balance, because balance is, I think, what oftentimes we miss out on when we're thinking about nutrition. Usually if you're hearing some type of new nutrition information, it's usually focused on just like one specific nutrient, or, you might hear someone say, if you want to, be at your best health or build lots of muscle, you need to just eat protein. And like, they will focus on just putting as much protein as possible on the plate, but then you kind of miss out on the other nutrients. So I feel like if there's any message I want anyone to take away from the book itself, is that, it's possible to nourish yourself properly without having to kind of completely exclude a food group. Right. And there's that whole idea of balancing around that. So like, it's important to still focus on those macronutrients, but we don't have to like single out one and tell someone that it's the most important one, because all of them are important in their own way. And I try to also expand on that by kind of putting that whole principle into action with the recipes themselves. So, instead of just doing like, for example, cauliflower tacos. I love cauliflower tacos. I think they're fantastic, but it's just cauliflower in a taco and there's no protein component to it that's going to help you stay full and satisfied for longer. So, we are focusing on, creating that balance with all of those meals.
I love it. I love it. Because that balance is important, because you don't want to have so much of one thing and be missing out on the other things, because if the goal is to be healthier from the inside out, you're still not really healthy if you're like ODing on one thing and leaving everything else out.
Yes. And, with all of that being said, another important thing to take into perspective with making any type of dietary change like this is to make sure that you're kind of going at your own pace. Everyone's always like, you have to make this change right now, or, you failed. And that's not how food works. Food is all about, trying it, seeing if it works for you, but also being able to adjust. If you're able to adjust things to your needs, it makes all the difference in terms of how, you go about, enjoying that food or enjoying your lifestyle. If you're miserable doing what you're doing, that's not something that's going to be sustainable. So, making sure that whatever choices you are making, make sure that they are sustainable to your needs.
Yes. Now, you already mentioned protein. I want to talk a little bit about just nutrition, plant-based nutrition, because I think that's the big thing. People think we know we need protein.
Yes.
And so a lot of people think, oh, well, you're not going to get protein if you're not eating meat. So from a nutritional perspective, what are some of the ways that we can make sure that we're getting enough protein if we are opting to go into a more plant-based diet?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, first starting off, like, you can get plenty of protein on a plant-based diet. In fact, a lot of research points to, the fact that we actually benefit when we're increasing the amount of plant-based protein over animal-based protein in our diet, which is really great. Now, the way that you can get that protein is just kind of like what I mentioned a few moments ago in regards to replacing the significant amount of protein that you might be getting from like a meat-based source, replacing it with a plant-based source. And there's quite a number of different ones that you can choose from. Typically, the most common ones would be things like soy-based products like tofu, tempeh, edamame, soybeans, like soy milk, like those types of things will all have protein to them. But then there's also other sources of plant-based protein. So like for people with soy allergies, for example, you might be consuming more beans. You can do pea proteins, for example. So there's like, pea protein powder, if you wanted to use that instead of like a whey protein powder for like a shake or something like that. And then you'll also get some proteins from different sources, including like nuts and seeds, whole grains. Those things kind of add up on your plate. So, instead of only having to rely on like one specific food group for that protein, you're also going to get it from like other plant-based ingredients as well.
Right. Now, you mentioned soy, and we know, and you talk about this in the book as well, that there have been some misconceptions about soy.
Yes.
So I know, I'll admit, I'm a person, I don't drink, dairy milk. I've been drinking plant-based milk for a long time. And initially it was soy. Then you started hearing things about soy. So I kind of moved into some other ones like almond milk or whatever the case may be. But is there anything in particular we need to know about soy specifically, just from a safety perspective?
Yeah, I mean, unless you have an allergy or unless you have some type of medical condition that would require you to either monitor how much soy you're taking in or, just advise not to take it in, there's not really a good reason to avoid it entirely. One thing I always try to remind people is that there are whole cultures, like, people within Asian cultures, like Japanese people, Chinese people, they are consuming soy quite regularly in their diet. And when they're consuming that soy, we're not seeing any ill effects, coming from research studies. If anything, there's quite a lot of benefit coming out in the research in regards to even things that people tend to be more concerned with when it comes to soy. And that's kind of like the most common would be like breast cancer because of fear of like high estrogen levels. But plant estrogen is not the same as animal estrogen. So it does not behave the same way in the body. And I think that's kind of like the main misconception that people tend to have when it comes to soy. Typically, the amounts that were originally fearmongered in a lot of research that came out was also done based on ridiculously high consumption levels of soy that normal average human beings weren't eating. So a lot of that information gets thrown into a headline. And then, without people being able to look at the study effectively, it's very easy to kind of look at that headline and just make the assumption that soy is just bad. But there's a lot of, benefits to it. It's been shown to help with reducing cancer reoccurrence, especially things like breast cancer. There are studies that show that it's also helped with like heart health as well. So lots of benefits. Main thing I would say when it comes to soy is just try to kind of choose the soy products that are least processed. So the ones that I mentioned, like tofu, tempeh, edamame, soybeans, like obviously those are going to be the least processed of those options.
I love edamame.
Yes. It's so good.
Yes, it is. It is. Now, this is something that comes up a lot, and you mentioned in the book as well about supplementation, because I think that a lot of us take them, and I have mentioned on previous shows that I've been guilty of probably taking too many supplements. Yeah. But you mentioned that if you're going to take supplements, that there might be a couple that you might want to consider more than maybe some others because you get other things out of your diet.
Yeah. So obviously everyone's supplementation needs are going to be different because there could be a whole host of reasons as to why someone needs to take a supplement or not. A good example would be things like iron. Like there's some people that just don't absorb iron well, and that has nothing to do with plant-based eating. It just that's just the way that their intestines absorb it. But, since everyone is different, it's always important to go to your physician or your primary care team just to kind of make sure that you are making the right choices with the amounts that you need and that kind of stuff. When it comes to plant-based eating in general, I would say the number one supplement that all vegans, vegetarians should be taking is a vitamin B12. And mostly because unless you are very consistent with making sure you're taking the appropriate fortified foods and doing the right amounts, sometimes it can be hard to hit the levels that you would need to absorb all the B12 that you would need. Mm-hmm. So I do recommend it. I also try to remind people too, because people get weary of taking supplements. They kind of automatically assume that means that a diet is inferior because you need supplementation. That's not necessarily the case, because even as we get older, B12 becomes less efficient for us to absorb anyway. So over time, you're probably going to need a supplement anyway from that. And all the supplement is doing is just making sure that you get your needs. B12 in general is just not something that we can get from plants because we live in a very sterile world, and everything is cleaned before we get it. So it's not realistic to kind of get that from those natural sources. We do store B12 quite a bit in our bodies, but over time, if you're not replacing the B12 there, you will get depleted, and you definitely don't want to get depleted because start making you feel sick, which is not ideal. And another vitamin that I tend to recommend is vitamin D. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of us tend to be inside all day. We're not usually exposed to the sun for long enough periods to make our own vitamin D. But even nowadays, it's probably not best to be like out in the sun all the time because, you know, you don't want to be getting skin cancer because of like constant UV radiation. So I think it's one thing, you know, just to kind of be mindful of, you know, get your levels checked, obviously. But that might be something to consider outside of maybe some of the sources that you would get from fortified foods. And then the last thing I recommend to my plant-based eaters is typically like an omega-3 supplement. And the reason I recommend it is because not every single plant-based eater, let alone like regular average people, are typically consuming enough omega-3s in their diet. And some great sources of omega-3s would be things like flax seeds, it would be hemp hearts, chia seeds, walnuts, like all of those have a specific plant-based omega-3 that's available to us to absorb. And those, if we're eating the appropriate amounts of it, like we can, you know, hit the omega-3 levels that are appropriate for us. But since a lot of us don't do that on a daily basis consistently, supplementation can sometimes be helpful in this area. So I often do recommend that as well.
Awesome. Awesome. We have a fan in the room. Margaret is saying, oh, she loves your food videos on TikTok. Helped you roast chickpeas in a new way. All right.
Yes. Thank you, Margaret. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm happy we're connecting as well. Well, I'm going to get into some recipe stuff here in just a second, but some of the other things in the book that you do talk about are like some of the grocery essentials, things that we need, and, you know, things that we can have at our disposal in our pantries and things like that that will allow us to prepare food. Because I think sometimes that's the problem. If you're not prepared, then it's easy to do other things or order out or whatever the case may be if you don't have some like staple things in your kitchen. So that's one. And then you do also talk some about meal prep. Yes.
I feel like having those two things set up will help take a lot of stress away from your week. I don't know how many times in my life before I started implementing those tips where I was looking at the kitchen and just dreading thinking of like, what's for dinner? Because that's always, you know, after a long day, like having to think like, oh, you know, what am I possibly going to cook during this time? And, you know, a lot of that indecision oftentimes eats up a lot of time. And then sometimes it will make you make a decision that you end up not really wanting later on anyway. Whether it's, hey, maybe you end up getting takeout, and takeout's totally valid if you want to enjoy a takeout meal, but more so like, let's say you bought all these groceries, but then didn't do anything with them. You just wasted money, like potentially throwing food out. And, you know, that in itself is not a pattern that you want to kind of get into. So I do recommend a couple of things. So I have a whole grocery pantry list of items. And I think one of the main things outside of just like the core things, like getting fruits and vegetables, getting beans, tofu, all of that stuff. My biggest tip and thing to kind of keep in the kitchen would be like your spices and your sauces. Like, I think those are the most key things, because even on a day where you might not feel like doing any cooking at all, if you have the right groceries, like you can make a very simple meal that still has a lot of flavor and doesn't require a lot of effort. You know, there was a time when I was in school for my master's in dietetics. And when I was doing that, I was working full time, and I had like 10 minutes really to kind of like put food together after a long day. And one of the quick meals that I came up with, which is actually kind of inspired a meal in the cookbook, is a pico de gallo bowl, which is, and when I was in school, I would do some quinoa. I would get like the microwave quinoa that Trader Joe's had, and I would put it in a bowl. I would get some of their pico de gallo, which, nowadays I make it myself, but when you're in a fix for something that is convenient and still has flavor, it was easy to kind of throw into the bowl with some black beans, and it was enough, and it was flavorful, and it really helped make life easy. So
There it is, right there.
that's exactly it.
Doesn't
And
it look good? Now that does not look boring, and that's
no,
the whole thing.
exactly. And that was just really three ingredients. And I
Mhm.
didn't have to do a lot of extra, to make that work. And that's kind of the same thing, with sauces. Like if you pick up a couple of dressings or sauces like from the store that can make your life easier, it's definitely worth having them on hand just so that way it makes those meals easy.
I love it. I love it. So let me see. Margaret is like, yes, take the shortcuts. I'm trying to make sure it gets up there. Take the shortcuts when you need them. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's good advice in a lot of things, Margaret.
Yes. Yeah. But it's kind of like that point where, when we're kind of talking about bland plant-based meals, if a meal is bland, it's going to discourage you from wanting to eat those vegetables, which is, obviously the end point. Like the end point is to get you to enjoy those vegetables so that way you're eating as many of them as possible and getting the benefit from them, right? Because if you are just, boiling broccoli, it's not going to taste good and you're not going to want to eat it by itself. But, if you roast it in a certain way and then top it with a sauce, like all of a sudden it makes it sound more enjoyable versus, the bland version that we just talked about.
Right. And not a bunch of heavy cheesy sauce either.
Yeah, ideally not. But I will say,
Every now and again.
yeah, I mean, for a lot of the people that I've counseled in the past, especially if you're just starting to learn how to like these types of vegetables, especially if you're not used to the texture or maybe, some of the bitter flavors are throwing you off, do what helps you get that entry, get that foot in the door to make those foods more enjoyable. So, if a little bit of those sauces or, things help to make it enjoyable, do it. Even if there's like a little bit more sodium or sugar or something like that you wouldn't want to be consuming regularly. Again, the whole idea is to help start changing the palate because it does take time. It's not going to be an overnight thing
Right.
where it's like, oh, I suddenly love every single vegetable. I wish it was like that would make my job easier, but it does take time to get used to everything.
Yeah, Margaret has mentioned hummus. Yeah, I love
Yes.
hummus. But when
Hummus
you're
is
talking about the vegetables that you don't like, there are two things that I did not like as a child that I
great.
actually like more now. I said earlier that I like spinach. I've always loved spinach, right? Even as a little girl, I wanted to be like Popeye. I love my spinach. But
Uh-huh.
I have learned to enjoy cabbage and
Mhm.
I've learned to enjoy Brussels sprouts because I always thought
Yeah.
Brussels sprouts were really bitter. But I found in more recent years, as people are preparing them in different ways,
Mhm.
I actually like Brussels sprouts.
Yes, I feel like uh, I remember eating them the first time and just not being a big fan when I was younger. And I feel like once you start learning some different cooking techniques, it makes all the difference in terms of how that vegetable tastes. Because
Mhm.
there's a lot of, cooking techniques, like, for example, roasting, those Brussels sprouts. That helps to kind of caramelize them, which brings out some of their natural sugars, and that's a very good example. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah,
Um,
braised orange ginger Brussels sprouts.
yes,
They look good.
yeah. Like I feel like when you get your vegetables caramelized, and that's different than steaming. I think that's very important to distinguish the two cooking methods because, for example, if you go to roast a bunch of Brussels sprouts on a sheet pan, I think sometimes instinctively we'll just try to get it on the pan, but we don't care if like things are overlapping. Sometimes that overlapping will cause things to steam, and then you don't get that same flavor profile that you would get if you like laid it all flat in a single layer so that all of it has like room to touch the pan. Like all those cooking methods really impact that final flavor result.
Mm-hmm. And since we're talking about veggies now I do love asparagus as well,
Yes.
but this one looks good as well. The seared asparagus with
Yeah.
pistachio coconut relish.
Yes, that is so good. I remember when I made that, I was snacking a lot that day when I shot that photo, and I feel like once I shot that, it became my snack plate, and I ended up just eating the whole plate of asparagus by myself.
Mm-hmm. Like this one here, and I'm going to go back to the front, but since we're on the
Yeah.
vegetable train, this is grilled maple Dijon lettuce.
Yes. I feel like a lot of people don't realize that you can grill lettuce. It's something that I learned early on in my dietitian career, and when I learned it, I was like, I don't believe that this is going to work, because I was just like, it doesn't sound like it would work because lettuce is very water dense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I finally decided to grill it, I just did it for a very short period of time just to get those sear marks. And when I did, it made all the difference in terms of flavor. It kind of it transformed what that lettuce was.
Yes, and yes, Margaret, she does have a cookbook. I just have an advanced copy. We have to wait a couple of weeks, but it's definitely available to go ahead and pre-order. Peaceful Kitchen is the cookbook. So
Yeah.
yes, so I know that you'll be getting one since you already love Catherine. So, but yes, I want to backtrack and go to breakfast, because you start with what people say is the most important meal of the day.
Yes.
And I told you this is going to sound real silly to some of you all, but when I was like reading all the the nutritional stuff and her story, Catherine's story, and all that, but when I turned the page and started looking at this food, I was like, ooh. I had emotion. I'm like, what's wrong with me? Because the food looks so good, but like, here are some smoothies. Look at
Those are so convenient to have in the morning. And I know I didn't talk a lot about the meal prep side of things, but that's kind of a good example of meal prep. And it's not necessarily like meal prepping the whole recipe, but like
right.
in meal prepping components of things like ahead of time, even just getting ahead and chopping things up, or in this case with the smoothies, if you put them most of the ingredients in like a storage container, you can just dump it into the blender in the morning and you don't have to measure anything else out. You can just blend it and go. And that's kind of like the benefit of doing small little preppable things ahead of time. So like if you get your groceries, like, rinse off your herbs and, store them in a plastic bag so you have them, in the fridge that you can just take out as you need it. You could do the same thing with other ingredients like pressing tofu, for example. Just get that out of the way instead of waiting the day that you plan to make that recipe. It just helps save a lot of time.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. Now, this is the second page. I also did the same thing. A second page of recipes, I should say. Overnight oats, 4 different ways. And I will admit, I love like regular oatmeal. I have been wanting to try overnight oats and have not done so yet, but these look really, really good.
Yeah, I feel like overnight oats are a fun way to play with flavors. So, I have like 4 full recipes in there, but even one of the recipes, it's like a lemon poppy seed overnight oat mix. You can technically switch out the lemon and use like key lime to make like a key lime pie flavor. So like
my favorite.
Yeah.
I love you, Catherine.
I feel like that's kind of like the whole idea. Like the idea of the recipes in this book, use them as a base and then expand on it. Cause I feel like everyone always shares like the most unique variations of how they make a recipe that I share on the internet. And, you know, it always is like, oh, I want to try that too. So I'm hoping that that gives you some, you know, room to play around with your food, because I think that's important for enjoyment.
Right. So play with your food. Isn't that the thing
Yeah.
that our parents told us not to do when we were little?
Well, now we're adults, so
we're adults. We can play with our food all we want. I'm just kind of skimming because we can't hit them all. But look at this breakfast tostados.
Yes. Yeah. If you like something crunchy, they're perfect. It's kind of like a fun play on avocado toast, because everyone loves avocado toast.
Right.
Now we're just adding the avocado to like a crispy corn tortilla. So you get whole grains from the corn tortilla. You get like the nice textural crunch, which is really nice. And you can load it up with tons of veggies, because that's normally like when you look at tostadas, like they have tons of vegetables on top. So you can play around with the different combinations that you like to top your tostada with as well.
Right. Now, this one blew my mind. Peach upside down baked oatmeal. So tell us a little bit about, because that looks like, Lord have mercy.
It is one of my favorite breakfast recipes. The whole idea behind it. So like when I first started Instagram, I used to always post an oatmeal like first thing in the morning. And I would post it consistently every single day, what oatmeal I was eating. And my love of oats kind of expanded from there. So I started doing overnight oats. I love baked oats. And, you know, when I was thinking of this recipe, we had like a bunch of ripe peaches. And so I wanted to kind of play around with the idea of like, ooh, like what about an upside down cake? Like, you know how they have like the pineapple upside down cake?
Right.
I was like, I wonder if I could do that with oats instead. So I put all the peach slices on the bottom, and then I poured the batter of the oats on top. And then I just prayed, and I was like, please just come out. And it did. It worked out really smooth. You just have to make sure you use parchment paper like on the bottom so it doesn't get stuck. But once you pull it out, you just flip it onto a cutting board, take a slice off, and then I love little whipped cream on top. But if you want it to be like more like dessert, you could do a little scoop of like vegan ice cream on top, or you could also do some yogurt if you want a little bit more protein. So a lot of different options you could do there.
Yes, I love that. And everyone, you see why I was just like, ooh, because it's the whole thing of it doesn't look boring. I am a person who loves complex flavors. You know, don't just give me salt and pepper and seasoned salt. I like things that, you know, whether it's savory or sweet, I like to taste different spices and things like that. So back to what you were saying about making sure you have the right ingredients and the right types of spices and things like that you can get and kind of play. So I love that. So that was the breakfast section. Then in the next section, you have salads, which also sometimes people can make a salad really boring.
Yeah.
These are not boring salads. Like I'm looking at this spicy peanut shaved Brussels sprout salad.
Yeah, that is a favorite because it kind of it touches on what we talked about with Brussels sprouts. So one thing I started doing within the last like 2 years, like since I started writing this cookbook, is I like to shred a lot of vegetables instead of just having them whole. I feel like it makes it more bite-sized. I feel like it makes it easier to eat. And when you roast them, I feel like it also helps to caramelize them faster. And like you get more caramelization because there's more surface area, you know, when you're roasting. So that with the sauce is just, I love it. So
another salad, charred poblano corn salad.
Yes. And I feel like this is a good example of like texture, because texture also helps a lot with salads. So like playing with different ingredients to help you get like a nice chew or a little crunch. You know, for this, like we have the crunch of the chickpeas, like having that. And then you get a little sweet from the corn and you get a little tang from the dressing. So there's a lot of play on flavor as well as texture to help make those dishes more exciting to eat.
Got another comment. Levels of flavor. Yes. Exactly. I'm with you on that, Patsy, because yes. So that makes a big difference. I like to like take a bite and be like, that's a little of this. I got a little of that. I enjoy being able to do that.
Yes.
We might go a couple minutes over because we got to show some of these
Yeah.
recipes. This is like a marinated sumac, onion, and lentil salad.
Yes. So if you've never marinated your onions before, I need you guys to get on board with marinating them. It's kind of like it's different from doing pickled onions,
Okay.
where you're marinating them in some different spices. Sometimes, in this case, we're using sumac, and that has kind of like a lemony flavor to it. So it's enhanced more with the addition of citrus to those onions. And what ends up happening is when you're adding the salt, the vinegar, the citrus, all those different elements, and then the herbs, when you mix it into the onions, they start to soften, but you still maintain a little bit of that crunch, but it helps enhance some of the sweetness of that onion as well. So it makes it very flavor packed. And when it's mixed in with those other ingredients in the salad, and it doesn't have to just be that, like you can add it to sandwiches, you can add it to wraps. There's lots of things you can do with them, but it helps add a tremendous amount of flavor.
Love it. This one looks really, really good. And we talk about having a colorful plate. Roasted cruciferous crunch salad.
Yes. So I'm a very big advocate for getting your cruciferous vegetables because they have a lot of cancer fighting agents in them. And, again, it's all about making them taste good. Because if you are not a fan of broccoli or Brussels sprouts or anything like that, I promise you, if you learn how to cook them properly, you'll probably enjoy them a lot better. And this salad helps to kind of infuse all those elements in there. It's packed with protein, and it's got like a lovely citrusy dressing that goes on top of it as well.
Good stuff. Okay, now I'm moving into some of the grab and go items. So this is the kale Caesar salad wrap.
Yes. So the thing that I replaced the regular croutons with is kind of like a tofu crusted crouton, if we want to call it, more crouton-like essentially. But it has all those seasonings, and the tofu gets baked in the oven and then thrown in the wrap, along with a Caesar dressing and some kale for just like that extra boost in nutrition. Really, really delicious. And I love it because you can make it for lunch. And because you're using the kale, it lasts a lot longer, which is really helpful. And yeah, everything stays very flavorful, in that wrap.
Okay. Oh, no. Yeah. Yeah, all of it looks good to me, and I'm making myself hungry. The chopped veggie tzatziki.
Yes.
Right, jar.
Yes.
I know jar salads are a big thing.
Yes, because I feel like with jarred salads, while they look very pretty, and I definitely understand that aesthetic about them, they're actually really practical because you want your salad to kind of have layers in there to help preserve it longer in your fridge. If you put your dressing on the bottom, whatever's touching that dressing is potentially going to spoil. So if you want to prolong that, you can add something that's going to be more hearty at the bottom. So you might choose to use like hearty vegetables, or maybe you add your grains to the bottom. And then like the more delicate things, like maybe the vegetables that spoil a little bit faster, like lettuce, for example. I think everyone's always worried about that going bad. If you put it on the top away from the liquid of the dressing on the bottom, that salad lasts a lot longer. So then all you have to do when you want to enjoy it is just mix everything up and then, put it in your bowl or eat out of the jar.
Yeah, I know my mom she has some, like, what do you call those? Mason jar.
Yes.
Actually it's like a mug, but it's a mason jar. It sits up on a handle, like it has a little stem, I should say.
Yes.
She likes to make salads in there, but she's not making that. But but I'm not talking about you, Mom. But yeah, she's not making that. But but yes, it is a good idea. And if you're on social media, a lot of different places, you see people making them. And you do also talk, just a quick sidebar, in the whole thing of food prep, about ways to make sure as you're prepping different things that you're packaging them properly to make sure that when you go back to grab it, it's not bad.
Yes. Yeah, because I think probably the most disappointing thing people, realize when they're grocery shopping is that things do have a shelf life. We shouldn't try to put things in the fridge and treat it like a science experiment to see like how long it's going to last. Ideally, like when you can, you want to eat something before it spoils. But to help prevent that from spoiling faster, because there are some foods that just spoil faster. Lots of different tricks to help prevent that. So I do share that in the beginning. Kind of like what I mentioned with the lettuce, like you just want to make sure it's dry. So, if you're storing it after you wash it, just make sure you keep a paper towel or something like that inside of it, and that will help absorb a lot of that extra moisture from there.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Now
Mm-hmm.
this here, I really want to try because I am a tuna lover, but of course we're talking plant-based, so
Mm-hmm.
this isn't tuna. This is spicy tuna salad sandwich. It
Yes.
looks like tuna.
Yeah. It's it's one of those things where I feel like a lot of people, when you're making the switch over to plant-based eating, it's very easy to feel like you're missing out on things. But that's kind of like an homage to kind of tell people like, you know, you can still enjoy a lot of the things that might be missing as long as you're looking to replace it in a very artful way. So,
Mhm.
like, for example, when we're thinking of tuna, you might feel nostalgic for that, but you can use other things to help mimic some of the texture. And in this, we're using a combo of chickpeas as well as hearts of palm. And when those are mixed together, you get like nice little shreds from the hearts of palm, and that mixes with the texture of the chickpeas along with some of the other flavors that we're adding to that salad mix to really help kind of mimic not just the texture but also the flavors. So if you're able to mimic those things, really what your brain is looking for is oftentimes those flavor profiles or those
Yes.
things that kind of give you the nostalgia of the food. And these are just like easy ways to kind of help get that feeling so you don't feel like you're missing out.
And I think that's really important that you say that because and we're not going to talk about it because get into it real deep because we want to
Yeah.
talk about this cookbook. But I think that's one of the things that pushes people towards some of these meat substitutes that
Mhm.
have because we're used to certain textures, and I'll admit I've been guilty of it. But we're used to certain textures or even certain flavor profiles, like you said, and so we're trying to repeat those textures or flavors, but using things that might not be all natural, so to speak, in order to do that. So that's what I like about this. And I know another one. You don't necessarily have it in here, but I know like people use what is it they use to make like the barbecue
Oh, the jackfruit.
jackfruit, for
Yeah,
example. So it's like giving you something different that gives you that texture, but it doesn't. It's just something different.
right,
So that's
right.
but this is a way. Now, this is bowls. I know we showed one, the pico de gallo bowl already, but
Mhm.
this is really good. Creamy miso noodle soup.
Yes, I love noodles. Noodles are like one of my favorite things, and
Mhm.
that I also love like creamy things. So like that's like a creamy soup base and very easy to throw together. So it doesn't take very long, which is nice. And you can kind of pick and choose the toppings that you want with it. I feel like with a lot of these bowls, they become like, for example, noodles. Noodles can oftentimes feel like they're not filling enough, but if you add enough protein, enough veggies to it, you can make a noodle bowl just as nourishing and nutritious, because again, we're completing that balance that we're talking about in the beginning.
Hmm. Now, Margaret, you mentioned hummus before, baked hummus pasta.
Yes. So this is actually probably one of the first viral recipes I had on my page, which is really crazy. And originally, when I made it, it was based off of the that baked feta pasta craze that everyone was,
Oh, yeah.
on when everyone was staying inside.
Right.
But I wanted a plant-based version, and while there is vegan feta available in the market, it's also very expensive and it's not
Mm.
always something that's easily accessible to everyone. So I wanted to try and come up with something that was, a version that would use accessible ingredients and, things that you could make at home, for example. And I decided on hummus. And at first I didn't think it was going to work. So I was just like, let me just experiment with it because um, I had some hummus in the fridge, and when I tried it with the tomatoes and the fresh basil mixed in, it came out so much better than I thought it was. And it had like the perfect creaminess without having to add any dairy cream or anything like that to it. And I showed it to my mother-in-law, who is like a very strong like Italian opinion about dishes, and I was very worried about her trying the pasta, and she loved it. She thought it was fantastic, and she said it has to be in the cookbook. So that's why it's there.
And we know that in a lot of our cultures, we love rice.
Yes.
Almost all cultures have some type of rice dish. So this is just one that you're having, the scallion, ginger, lentil, fried rice.
Yes. That one is really, really good. And I know a lot of people roast chickpeas, but I actually like to roast lentils a lot. And that's what I used in that fried rice. It's a very easy way to, add a ton of protein, and it adds like the little nice crunch to the fried rice when you mix it in as you're stir frying it in your pan.
All right. One more in this section, then move on. Brothy beans and greens.
Yes. I feel like everyone just needs a nice bowl of some type of brothy based soup with a nice hunk of bread and just like the ultimate comfort. Yeah. That's exactly what it's supposed to be. It's just a nice, very umami rich flavored broth. And I feel like bread's like the perfect thing to kind of dunk into it.
Okay. Sticky ginger tofu meatballs. Now, this is in the nutrient packed main dish section.
Yes. Yeah. So, one of the reasons that's there is because I wanted a section that kind of highlighted some more like higher protein meal options. And like we were talking about before, protein is definitely on that higher protein tier. And that's a really easy recipe that you can also meal prep ahead of time. Like you can make a whole batch of those meatballs and then use them for meal prep during the week, or throw them into different dishes as an easy protein source.
Oh, we have a quick question from Jean. Her question is, I've cut out brown rice and substitute quinoa because of negative things I've read about rice. What say you?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question because when we're thinking about rice, there's a couple of areas that people talk about, but usually the one I hear most often is in regards to the nutrition profile of it. People feel like there's other nutrient dense things, like, for example, quinoa, like was mentioned. I think it's important to vary up your sources. Like a lot of cultures may utilize rice heavily, but you might find benefit by kind of switching out different grains to get different nutrients. Another issue people tend to get concerned with would be things like arsenic in rice. So usually this is more of an issue if you're using like brown rice, because like just a lot of the arsenic just kind of gets into the shell of it. But that's also dependent on where it's grown. So like, for example, some brands like Lumberg Farms, for example, like they test their rice for arsenic. So like there's not usually that issue. But it's also something, again, where there's always benefit to like swapping out, your grains here and there. So that way you get a whole variety of different nutrients, but also, you're not consuming anything in excess. For example, like that arsenic.
Okay. See, I never heard that. So thanks for asking that question, Jean. Arsenic and brown rice. And admittedly, I don't eat a whole lot of rice, but when I do, I tend to go brown rice instead. but I hadn't even heard about arsenic. So
Yeah. And again, like that would be more so if you were consuming it in very high levels. So like, for example, if that was like the only grain you ate, then I would be like, oh, you might want to consider maybe even swapping for white rice. It has much less because they take the outer shell of the rice out.
there's something in the shell. Okay,
Right.
got it.
And, I know some people would be concerned with regular rice, like just having white rice, but remember, it's just one component of the meal. Like you can get tons of fiber and other nutrients from adding things like beans or vegetables to your plate. And that's kind of like how a lot of cultures around the world do it. Like a lot of rice-based cultures, you'll primarily see them eat white rice, but it's usually with other nutrient-dense foods along with that white rice to balance it out.
Got it. I promise I'm not going to keep you here all night. Looking so good. Up next, tofu tinga tacos.
Yes. So if you visit my page often, you might have seen me at least shred tofu once, where I use like a box grater and I just shred the tofu to kind of like, I guess like you can make it like the equivalent of like shredding chicken in a sense, except it's obviously tofu. But the nice thing about it is that it gives the tofu more surface area. So like if you're adding sauces and things like that, you get a nice texture with that shred from the tofu. And it helps to better absorb and coat that tofu with sauce. So you're not tasting like the beaniness from like the tofu, when you're having it in a taco like this.
And we just got a comment. Patsy said, I can't seem to get into tofu. Now, is the thing about tofu is that it takes on the flavor of whatever seasoning and things you have with it?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here, but I would say like the two quick tips that I have with tofu is to be mindful of the type that you get and then also how you're prepping it, because the things that you do to prep it ahead of time make a huge difference in terms of the texture and taste of it over time, like when you're cooking it. So, one thing I recommend in the book is to use a tofu press, because if you look at most types of tofu, they come in like a tub of water, and tofu itself is very waterlogged. So, if you're just taking it out of the package and cutting it up to use in a dish, that tofu is going to be very watery. And it's going to make it harder for it to take on the flavor that you're looking for. It also can impact the texture. Like if you have something that's more waterlogged, it's going to be squishy and it's not going to, get that same texture that you might be looking to get from it. Like if you're trying to crisp it up. So my biggest tips, either start with extra firm tofu and make sure you press it to get the water out. Or there's some brands like Nasoya, they have a super firm tofu, which is like in a vacuum sealed package where you don't have to press it at all. And you can just use that to start off with. I feel like it's the easiest for people that are new to tofu and easiest to work with because it's like the firmest that you can get tofu wise.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks for the question, Patsy. You have the grilled lemongrass. I might be saying it wrong. Say it for me. You know what it is. The skewers. Is it seitan?
Seitan.
Seitan.
Yeah. So it's
like meat, though.
Yes.
It's not, but it looks like.
Yes. So in a lot of Chinese cuisine, they actually utilize wheat gluten, which is kind of like the protein component of the wheat. And they use it to make a lot of protein-based vegetarian style ingredients and dishes. And it gets nice and chewy in that recipe. So it's there to kind of like give you that impression of like what you mentioned, meat. So that way you're getting that chew, because a lot of people want that chew when they're, thinking of a hearty meal.
You are right, Patsy. That's why I was like, ooh, and that's why we're going a little over, because I could have showed one or two, but
yeah. Thank you, Patsy.
I am so excited. So we talked about veggies earlier on, so I'm gonna move on to some coconut lime energy bars.
Yeah. So just a fun, like sweet little treat that you can use to, use as a snack or like to end your day off with. Very simple ingredients, whole food ingredients, which I think is really helpful because they tend to help fill us up a lot more than if we're using like more processed ingredients.
Mm-hmm. Cinnamon swirl banana nut muffins.
Those I've been thinking about making those for the longest time, but like right now it's fruit fly season, so
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to like hold off until it gets just a little bit cooler. But those are so good. They're also great if you want to meal prep them for like snacks or like different like breakfast option on the go. They're very yummy.
Okay, I think I got two more, and then I'm going. We can wind it down. Single serve chocolate chip cookie. Now, come on.
Yeah.
You said earlier in the book, in your intro, that you love sweets, and I have sweet teeth, not just a sweet tooth. So yes, that just looks like.
Oh my gosh, I think about sweets a little bit too much. But honestly, like one of the things that I was the most worried about with plant-based eating or switching over to plant-based eating was that I would not be able to enjoy the sweets that I liked. Like I used to very confidently and proudly like house down like whole sleeves of chocolate chip cookies by myself. And so like I had to make sure that I could still make the things that I loved to eat so that way I could enjoy them. And I actually found it pretty easy to kind of make the switch for a lot of, desserts and sweets that I was looking for. So that's kind of like the homage to the beginning, that single serve cookie.
Okay, last thing I'm going to actually show. This is the lemon blueberry swirl loaf.
Yes. So that one uses some blueberry jam, which I think, in my opinion, I like even better than using like regular blueberries inside because it has like that extra sweetness. So it really helps balance out a lot of the flavors inside the lemon loaf itself. I do have a jam recipe in the book.
Yes.
So like, that's what I used for that photo, but you can use any store-bought jam that you like. If you go to the farmer's market, you could grab like a nice blueberry jam and use inside. Or use a different, fruit jam altogether, and you can kind of transform that loaf however you like.
I love it. And then the last chapter is actually about the sauces and stuff, which we've already kind of talked about. The power of the sauce.
Sauce is so important. So I had to have a chapter all about it.
Yes. So everyone, this is the cover again. Peaceful Kitchen. It'll be out. Is it the 13th or something like that?
The 13th, yes.
Oh, a good memory for
me.
So yes, it'll be out on the 13th. I am blessed to have this advanced copy. I really would suggest, especially for those of you that are looking to make some changes to incorporate more delicious, flavorful plant-based food into your life, I definitely suggest you pick up a copy. There are a couple of places where you can get it and support Brown Girl Collective, one of which is the Brown Girl Collective bookstore, which is just that, browngirlcollectivebookstore.com, which is affiliated with Bookshop for those of you who shop on Bookshop. And it is also available at BGC Books and More on Amazon if you're an Amazon shopper. But yes, it's still a good time to place a pre-order, which pre-orders are always good for authors or, new authors, established authors, whatever the case may be, because that shows that folks have an interest and they're excited about getting the book. So I definitely suggest that whether you get it from one of my sources or wherever, please pick up a copy, and if you can pre-order, you may even get it the day it comes out.
Yes, it's very much appreciated. I know it's always hard to kind of like ask people for pre-orders, but every pre-order, absolutely appreciate it. If you do pre-order, you can go to my website and get some extra freebies. I have some extra resources, nutrition resources, as well as recipes that didn't make the book. So if you're looking for some extra eats in the meantime while you're waiting those couple of days left to get the book, highly recommend those extras.
Yes, and I would suggest, that if you're not already following Catherine, that you do go ahead and do that. All of her socials was easy because they're all the same, and then also the website, because that's a way just to stay in touch and stay abreast. Because yes, there's this book that's coming out with over 100 recipes, but you're always creating and
Yep.
developing
I
more.
always have more recipes. So even if you are, just looking for something right now, I have a ton of resources and things available to you guys. So take advantage of it. I try to make as much stuff free and accessible because I know, it helps people. So if I'm able to help you with one recipe, then I feel like I've done my job for the day. So
Yes, yes. So since you are getting ready to release the book and on the 13th, are there any like places that you'll be either online or in person where because people watch from all over the place here.
yes.
So are there any spaces where people maybe can be on the lookout for you, where they can come meet you and get a book signed or anything like that?
Yeah, so I have some events coming up in August. So I have a book signing in Ridgewood, New Jersey at a bookstore called Bookends. I will be also giving some exclusive recipe cards. So if you want some recipes that haven't dropped on the website and you want to be like the first to have it, like definitely attend. And then I have another event at Riverbend Bookstore, which is in Connecticut. And for that event, I'll actually be doing a cooking demo and doing a conversation there as well. So if you are interested in any of that, you can get tickets for that as well.
All right. And once again, follow Catherine on social media and all of that, because I know you'll be updating. Actually, there was something you put in stories right before we came live. So I know you'll be putting all that stuff out so you can kind of see where she'll be and things like that. So I know we went way over, but it was worth it. Thank you for your patience with me and, sitting here drooling over your cookbook. And we're able to answer everyone's questions, so I really do appreciate you, Catherine, and it's been such a blessing to have you here. And just know that you have another cookbook or anything exciting going on, you'll always be welcome to come here and share with the BGC audience, because we're always looking to learn different things that are going to help us to live as well as we possibly can. So thank you, we do appreciate that. So if you can just hold on for me, don't hang up. But I'm gonna say goodnight to everybody else. Because I know I held you a little longer, like that preacher in church. I'm not gonna hold you for long. and I'm about to close. Not telling the truth. So everyone, just look online to see who's coming next week, because as I said, I don't want to hold you any longer. But thank you for being here. I appreciate you, and you have a great rest of the week, and as always, continue to live well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.